The wind doesn't knock on the door of a lighthouse. It breaks it down. You feel it before you hear it, a low vibration that moves up through the soles of your boots, through the rotting wooden floorboards, through the iron spiral staircase that hasn't held a keeper wait in over 60 years. The salt is in everything here. It's in the peeling paint that curls off the walls like dead skin. It's in the rust that has turned every nail and hinge the color of old blood. It's in your mouth, sharp and cold and faintly metallic, the way the air tastes when a place has been forgotten by the living, but remembered by something else entirely. The light is gray outside, not the gentle gray of an overcast morning, but the gray of a sky that has made up its mind. The Atlantic stretches out beyond the cracked glass of the lantern room, flat, dark, and indifferent. Somewhere below, the waves hit the rock shelf with a sound like a door slamming over and over and over again. A rhythm, a warning, a heartbeat that belongs to the sea, not to you. There is a desk in the corner of the watchroom, small, scarred with years, and on that desk, beneath a shattered pane of glass that someone placed there long ago to keep things from blowing away, sits a logbook. Its cover is the color of charcoal. Its spine is cracked but holding. The brass clasp that once locked it shut has corroded open, as if it has been waiting not for just anyone, but specifically for the hands that are about to open it right now. You reach for it, and the moment your fingers touch the cover, the wind howls low and long through the broken seams of the lighthouse walls. Like something just woke up, that sound, that hollow, grieving sound, is the sound this story has been making for over a century. And today, right now, you are going to hear every single word of it. Welcome back to the Fear Sermon. My name is the voice that keeps you up at night, and what we are about to go through together is not a ghost story. It is something worse. It is a true one. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because we cover the darkest, strangest, and most forgotten corners of American history every single week. And after you subscribe, drop a comment below telling us what state you are watching from, because this story has roots that stretch into every coastline in this country, and we want to know where you are standing when it all hits you. Now, let us begin. There is a mystery at the center of this story that has never been solved. Not by historians, not by maritime investigators, not by the families who spent decades searching for answers. The mystery is this: how does a lighthouse keeper in the late 1800s write a detailed entry in his logbook about a ship arriving at his station? A ship he describes in extraordinary detail, with its name, its captain, its cargo, and the condition of its crew, when the official record, the ironclad maritime record kept by the United States government, states with absolute certainty that this exact ship, with this exact name, sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean 40 years before the night the keeper claims it arrived. Not a similar ship, not a ship with a similar name, the same ship, identical name, identical description, identical captain's surname. The same vessel that went down in a documented storm with documented loss of life in a documented location hundreds of miles away, somehow docked at a lonely lighthouse on the American coast 4 decades later, and a sober, veteran lighthouse keeper wrote it all down in careful, steady handwriting. What happened that night? What did he see? What or who came up from the water? And most importantly, why, when the government was finally shown this logbook entry more than 100 years later, did they quietly move the file to a restricted archive instead of explaining it? That is the question. That is the wound at the center of this story that has never closed. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will have every piece of the puzzle, every document, every witness account, every expert analysis. What you do with those pieces is up to you, but I promise you, once you see the full picture, you will not be able to unsee it. To understand what happened at that lighthouse, you first need to understand the world it existed in. Because nothing about this story makes sense without the darkness that surrounded it on all sides. We are talking about the period historians sometimes call Dark America. not a single era, but a long, bruising stretch of American history that runs roughly from the end of the Civil War through the early years of the 20th century. It is a period that does not get the attention it deserves in school textbooks, because what happened during those decades is deeply uncomfortable. It is a period of tremendous industrial expansion on one side and tremendous human suffering on the other, and the tension between those two things shaped every institution in the country, including the United States Lighthouse Service. The Lighthouse Service, which would later be absorbed into what we now call the Coast Guard, was one of the oldest federal agencies in American history. It was established in 1789, the same year George Washington took office, and for over a century it operated a network of lighthouses up and down every coastline in America: the Atlantic seaboard, the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, the Pacific Shore. At its peak, the service maintained over 1,000 light stations, each one staffed by a keeper whose job was simple in description and brutal in reality: keep the light burning, keep the log, keep people alive. The logbooks these keepers maintained were not optional. They were federal documents. They were the official record of everything that happened at a light station: every ship that passed, every storm that hit, every supply delivery, every visitor, every mechanical failure, every unusual occurrence. Keepers were trained to be precise, unemotional, and thorough. They wrote in the same careful, bureaucratic language you would find in a government report, because that is exactly what these logs were. They were legal documents. They were, in the most literal sense, the record of what happened, which makes what one keeper wrote in his log on a specific night in the 1880 so deeply disturbing, because he was not a man who wrote things he did not see, and what he wrote he saw. The coastline where this lighthouse stood was one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the eastern United States. It had earned its reputation over centuries. The currents there are unpredictable, the weather changes without warning, and the underwater geography, the shoals, the reefs, the hidden rock formations just beneath the surface, had torn open the hulls of ships since the first European vessels attempted the passage. Local fishermen had a name for the worst section of that coast. They called it the graveyard, not as a metaphor, as a description, because the bottom of the ocean out there was, in truth, a graveyard, filled with wrecked vessels, lost cargo, and the remains of men and women who never made it to shore. It was into this world, this dark American coast, that our key players were dropped. And it is their stories, their very specific, very human stories, that make what happened not just strange, but heartbreaking. The first person you need to know is the lighthouse keeper himself. His name was Elias Marsh, and by all accounts, he was exactly the kind of man the Lighthouse Service wanted running a remote station. He was 53 years old at the time of the events we are covering. A compact, weathered man with large hands, and a reputation for absolute reliability. He had been a keeper for 22 years at that point, first at a small station on the Chesapeake, then briefly at a Great Lakes post, and finally, for the last 14 years of his career, at the isolated light station on the Atlantic coast that is the center of this story. The service's internal evaluations of Marsh, which still survive in federal archives, describe him consistently with the same words: dependable, accurate, temperate. That last word, temperate, was important in an era when lighthouse keeping and alcohol were unfortunately well acquainted, and the service took pains to note the sober judgment of its more trustworthy employees. Marsh did not drink, he did not embellish. He had never in 22 years of service filed a report that was later found to be inaccurate. He was, in the language of his time, a man of his word. His wife, Clara, had lived at the station with him for the first 8 years of his posting, but she died of fever in the winter of 1873, and after that Marsh lived alone. He had 2 adult children, a son named Thomas, who worked the merchant shipping trade out of Baltimore, and a daughter named Ruth, who had married a schoolteacher and moved to Ohio. Marsh wrote to both of them regularly. His letters, several of which have been preserved, reveal a man of quiet depth, someone who observed the world with great attention and felt things deeply, but expressed emotion only through the precision of his observations. When he wrote about a sunset, you could feel the loneliness underneath the beauty. When he wrote about a passing ship, you could sense the pull of connection, the wish, not quite spoken, to be part of something moving rather than something fixed. The second person central to this story is a man named Captain Jonas Aldrich. Aldrich was, by the time of our story, dead, and had been dead for 40 years. He was the captain of a merchant brigantine called the Mercy Jane, which was registered out of Providence, Rhode Island, and engaged in the coastal trade between New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The Mercy Jane carried timber, dry goods, and occasionally passengers along the eastern seaboard. Aldrich had commanded her since 1837 and was known in the Providence shipping community as a careful, experienced captain, not a man who took unnecessary risks. In the autumn of 1843, the Mercy Jane left Providence with a full cargo and a crew of 11 men. She ran into a severe nor'easter off the coast 2 days out. The storm was documented by at least 3 other vessels that survived it. The Mercy Jane did not. She went down in deep water, and Jonas Aldrich, along with all 11 members of his crew, was declared lost. The date of her sinking was logged by the Providence Harbor Authority. Her loss was reported to the federal government. Jonas Aldrich was officially, legally, historically dead as of November 14, 1843. The third key figure is a man named Deputy Inspector Raymond Cole, who worked for the United States Lighthouse Service's Atlantic District. Cole was the official who first reviewed Marsh's logbook after the events we are about to describe. He was by training a practical man, a former ship's mate who had risen through the administrative ranks of the service and whose job was to audit the logbooks of keepers in his district, investigate any reported irregularities, and maintain the integrity of the federal record. Cole's own letters and official reports from the period are among the most valuable documents we have, because they show us a bureaucrat genuinely struggling between what the record said and what a man he trusted was claiming to have witnessed. Now, there is a fourth figure, and this one is harder to describe, because the fourth figure is the Mercy Jane herself. A ship is not a person, but in this story, that ship functions like one. She has a history, she has a name, she has a reputation, and she has a presence on that particular stretch of coast that goes back further than most people know, further, perhaps, than is comfortable to examine. The Mercy Jane was not just any vessel. She had connections to that specific lighthouse, to that specific stretch of coastline that predate her sinking. Connections that, once you know about them, make the logbook entry read less like a supernatural event and more like the final chapter of a very long story. A story about loss, about the things we cannot let go of, and about the way the sea sometimes returns what it takes. But never completely, never cleanly. The night it happened was a Thursday in late October, in what the logbook identifies as the 22nd year of Marsh's service at the station. The date, referenced with the service's personnel records, places it precisely in 1884. The weather that evening had been rough since mid-afternoon. A building northeast wind, heavy swells, intermittent rain that came in horizontal sheets, driven by gusts that rattled the lantern room glass. Marsh had lit the light early, well before sunset, because the visibility was dropping fast. He noted the conditions in his log at 4:15 in the afternoon with the professional detachment of a man who had weathered 1,000 such nights. Wind NE, force 7, increasing. Visibility reducing, rain, light activated at 1,615. He made his next standard entry at 7 in the evening. Wind increasing, now estimated force 9, heavy seas running, no vessels sighted, light functioning, standard language. Standard entry, nothing to suggest what was coming. At 9:47, everything changed. Marsh heard it before he saw it, a sound he described in his log as a bell. Not the automatic bellboy that marked the outer reef, which he knew well and whose rhythm he could have identified in his sleep. This was different. This was, in his words, a ship's bell, 3 rings, clear and close, sounding from somewhere directly below the station on the leeward side. He went to the watchroom window, he looked out, and what he saw he wrote down in the same careful, unhurried handwriting he used for every other entry in 22 years of service. He wrote, "A vessel has come to anchor in the cove below the station. She is a 2-masted brigantine, showing no lights, in apparent sound condition despite the weather. She has not struck any shoal. I am going down to investigate, as her presence here without signal or prior notice is irregular." He went down. The path from the lighthouse to the small cove below was steep and slick with rain, but Marsh knew every stone of it. He had walked it in darkness hundreds of times. He reached the water's edge and stood there, and the ship was real. Real in the way that only something physical can be real. It displaced water, it had weight. It moved with the swells in the way a substantial vessel moves. He could see the lines of her hull, the set of her masts, the shape of her figurehead. He called out, and someone called back. In his log, Marsh described the man who came to the rail as tall, in oilskins, with a white beard, answering to the name of Aldrich. He described a brief conversation conducted at a distance, across the water, in the rain. The man at the rail said they had been caught in the weather and needed shelter for the night. He asked about the depth of the cove. He asked about the condition of the anchorage. Marsh answered his questions. He noted that the man's voice was calm, even in the storm unnaturally calm. He wrote, though he did not say what he meant by that precisely. He returned to the lighthouse. He made his entry. And then, at the bottom of that entry, in handwriting slightly less steady than the lines above it, he wrote something that has made maritime historians and researchers stop cold for over a century. He wrote, "I believe this vessel to be the brigantine, Mercy Jane, Aldrich commanding, out of Providence. I have noted her name on her bow. I cannot account for this, as the Mercy Jane and all her crew were lost in the storm of November 1843, this being confirmed to me by the service's own records at the time of that loss. I will report this matter to the inspector in the morning. I do not know what to make of it. He never made that report. Because by morning the ship was gone, not moved to a different anchorage, not sailed away in the night. Gone, the cove was empty. The anchorage showed no marks of cable or chain on the bottom, which Marsh could see clearly in the morning light when the weather broke. There was no evidence that a vessel of any size had spent the night there. There was nothing, except for something Marsh found on the rocks at the water's edge when he went down to look. He described it in his log. It was a piece of timber, clearly from a ship, weathered to the bone-gray color of very old wood, with a partial name still legible in the grain, the letters MERC. He kept it. He brought it back to the lighthouse. He put it on the shelf above his desk, next to a small photograph of his wife. He never spoke of the incident to his children. He never spoke of it to the service directly, though he filed a brief note in his monthly summary mentioning an unidentified vessel sheltering in the cove, the barest, most minimal acknowledgement that something had happened, stripped of the detail and the name that made it significant. Whether that was deliberate caution or the instinct of a man who knew that what he had written in his private log that night was something no official report could contain, we cannot know. What we know is what he wrote, and what he wrote he had written. When Deputy Inspector Raymond Cole reviewed the logbook during his regular audit of the station 3 months later, he found the entry immediately. His official response was to note it as an anomalous observation requiring clarification. His private response, recorded in a letter to a colleague in the service's Boston office, a letter that was not intended to be a formal document and therefore carries a kind of rawness that official reports never do, was something else entirely. Cole wrote, "I have read Marsh's October entry 3 times now, and I find I cannot simply mark it as an error and move on. Marsh is not a man who makes errors of this kind. He has been keeping this station for 14 years, and his logs are the most consistently reliable in my entire district. What he describes, I will say it plainly, is impossible. The Mercy Jane is on record as lost in 1843. I have confirmed this myself against the Providence Harbor records. And yet Marsh describes her by name, by configuration, and by captain with the kind of detail a man includes when he is certain, not when he is guessing. I do not know what to do with this. I am going to speak to Marsh directly when I visit the station next month. Cole visited the station in April of 1885. The conversation he had with Marsh was summarized in Cole's personal journal, which his family donated to a maritime history collection in the 1940s. According to that journal, Marsh was calm and clear during the interview. He did not embellish. He did not add dramatic detail. He simply said, in the direct manner that apparently characterized everything about him, "I wrote what I saw. I saw what I wrote. I cannot explain it, and I am not going to try, but I will tell you this, the ship was real. She was as real as this table between us, and the man at the rail looked like a man who has been a very long time at sea." Cole pushed him on the question of the name. How could he be certain it was the Mercy Jane? Marsh's answer, as Cole recorded it, was this: "Because I knew her before she was lost. I worked a season on a vessel out of Providence in my youth, before I joined the service, and the Mercy Jane was a regular sight in that harbor. I knew her lines, I knew her figurehead, and I saw her name on her bow with my own eyes, in the light of my own lantern, from no more than 30 feet away. It was the Mercy Jane." Cole left the station. He filed a muted official report noting the logbook entry and Marsh's confirmation of it, with a recommendation that it be retained in the station file without further action. He used the bureaucratic language of a man closing a door, but in his journal that same night he wrote something that has stayed with researchers who have found his papers ever since. He wrote, "I believe him. God help me, I believe him. And I do not know what that means for anything I thought I understood about the nature of this work." Marsh retired from the service in 1889, 5 years after the night of the Mercy Jane. He moved to Baltimore to be closer to his son Thomas. He lived quietly. He did not, as far as anyone can determine, speak of the incident publicly. He died in 1901 at age 70 and was buried in a Baltimore churchyard. His logbooks from the station were, per standard procedure, archived with the United States Lighthouse Service records. The logbook with the October 1884 entry sat in those archives for decades, not hidden, not restricted, simply part of an enormous collection of similar documents that no one had reason to examine in detail. It was a maritime historian named Dr. Francis Wentworth who found it first in the 1960s, while researching a broader history of lighthouse keeping on the Atlantic coast. Wentworth was not looking for mysteries. She was looking for social history. What was life actually like for the men and women who staffed these isolated stations? She was reading through Marsh's logbooks, which she had selected because of their reputation for thorough, detailed record keeping, when she turned a page and stopped breathing for a moment. She cross-referenced the entry that same day. She pulled the Providence Harbor records for 1843. She pulled the Lighthouse Service personnel files on Elias Marsh. She pulled everything she could find on the brigantine Mercy Jane. And what she found, the collision between what the records said and what Marsh had written, is what she described in a paper she published in a small maritime history journal in 1969 as the most troubling document she had encountered in 30 years of archival research. That paper attracted almost no attention when it was published. The journal had a small readership, the subject was obscure, but it found its way eventually to a retired maritime attorney named Harold Steins, who had spent a career handling inheritance and salvage claims in New England and who had, in the course of that career, developed an extensive private collection of documents related to vessel losses on the Atlantic coast. Steins read Wentworth's paper in 1971 and immediately recognized something she had not emphasized, something that, once you see it, changes the weight of the whole story entirely. The Mercy Jane had made a stop at that exact lighthouse station in the summer of 1842, 1 year before she sank. The station's logbook from that period recorded her arrival, her captain's name, and the reason for the stop: routine shelter during a weather delay. Aldrich had spent 2 days at the station. The keeper at the time, not Marsh, who had not yet joined the service, recorded the visit in routine terms. Aldrich had taken meals with the keeper. He had inspected the light. He had, according to the entry, expressed a particular admiration for the station's location and remarked that if a man were going to be stranded somewhere indefinitely, this would not be a bad place. 1 year later, Jonas Aldrich and the Mercy Jane were at the bottom of the Atlantic. 40 years after that, Elias Marsh looked out at the cove below his station and saw them there again. Harold Steins brought these 2 documents, the 1842 arrival record and the 1884 entry, together in a formal presentation to the New England Maritime Historical Society in 1973. The room, by several accounts, was very quiet when he finished. A retired Coast Guard commander named Edgar Vance, who was in the audience that day, later told an interviewer that the silence lasted nearly a full minute before anyone spoke. When someone did speak, they asked the question everyone in the room was thinking: if Aldrich had genuinely admired the station, if he had genuinely said that he would not mind being stranded there. Could the sea have remembered that? Could something about that man's attachment to that place have pulled him back across 40 years and fathoms of dark water? Vance said he did not believe in that kind of thing. He said he had spent 30 years on the water, and he had never seen anything that could not be explained by physics and weather and human error. Then he paused, and he said, "But I have also spent 30 years on the water, and I will tell you that the sea is not the same as a road. It does not forget. It does not let go. The things that go into it, they do not always stay gone." The moral weight of this story is significant, and it deserves to be handled carefully, because what happened to Elias Marsh is not just a strange event. It is an illustration of something true about the human condition, something that the dark America period, with all its violence and displacement and grief, expressed in its own brutal way. The Civil War had ended less than 20 years before the night Marsh saw the Mercy Jane. The country was full of ghosts, not in the supernatural sense, but in the very real sense that millions of Americans were living alongside losses that had never been properly mourned, never properly accounted for, never resolved. The lighthouse, as an institution, was a monument to that kind of vigil. You kept the light burning for the ships that might be out there in the dark. You watched, you waited. You kept the record, and sometimes what the darkness sent back to you was not what you expected. What Marsh wrote in his log is at its core a document of witness. He was a man of 63 years of experience on and around the water. He was a man who had spent 22 years keeping a precise, reliable record of everything he observed. And on one October night, he observed something that the record said was impossible, and he wrote it down anyway because that was his job, and because he was a man who wrote what he saw. The courage in that act is easy to overlook. It would have been far easier, far safer, to write nothing, to close the logbook and keep it closed, to let that night be just another storm, just another watch, just another entry about wind speed and wave height and the light burning on. He did not do that. He wrote what happened. And in doing so, he left behind something that has outlasted him by over a century, a question that the record cannot answer, a gap in the official version of events that no amount of archival reorganization has been able to close. There is one more piece to this story, and it is the piece that keeps it alive. In 1987, a coastal preservation group petitioned the federal government to have the now decommissioned Lighthouse Station declared a historic landmark. As part of the review process, the National Archives was asked to compile all extant records relating to the station. A researcher working on that compilation encountered the 1884 logbook entry and the coal correspondence and flagged them for review. The resulting consultation between the archives, the Coast Guard's Historical Office, and an unnamed agency whose involvement is noted in the paperwork, but whose identity is redacted, concluded with a recommendation that the relevant documents be transferred to a restricted collection pending further review. That transfer happened in 1989. The logbook itself, the physical object, the leather-covered volume with Marsh's handwriting in it, was moved out of the General Atlantic District Archive and into a restricted federal collection. Dr. Wentworth's paper and Steins's presentation documents are still accessible to researchers. The Cole correspondence is still accessible. But the original logbook, the thing itself, the document in Marsh's own hand, that is now behind a wall of access restrictions that no researcher has successfully penetrated since 1989. The stated reason for the restriction is preservation, the physical condition of the document. Archivists who have been asked about it informally have said only that documents of this age and sensitivity are sometimes removed from general circulation to prevent deterioration. No one who has looked closely at this case accepts that explanation entirely. Because the Lighthouse Service archives contain dozens of logbooks from the same period in the same condition, and none of them have been restricted. The 1884 logbook is unique in one way. It contains an entry that creates a direct, documented, irresolvable conflict with an official federal maritime loss record. And the government, it seems, would prefer that conflict not be too easily accessible. What remains accessible, what we have, what researchers like Wentworth and Steins have given us, is enough. The entry exists, the Mercy Jane's sinking is documented, the 1842 visit is documented, Cole's belief is documented, Marsh's retirement and death are documented. And the timber with the letters MERC, the piece Marsh brought back from the rocks that morning, the piece he placed on the shelf next to his wife's photograph, that timber's location is unknown. It was not among Marsh's possessions when he died. It was not found at the lighthouse station when preservation workers inventoried the building in the 1970s. It is gone as completely as the ship it came from. Somewhere on the Atlantic coast, there is a lighthouse that still stands. It is decommissioned now, no keeper, no light, no log being kept. The building is maintained by a preservation trust, and you can visit it if you know where to look and who to ask. The watch room where Marsh wrote his entries is intact. The desk is still there. The shelf above the desk where he kept his wife's photograph and a piece of gray timber is still there. It is empty now. But the indentation in the wood, the faint, weathered outline where an object sat for years, perhaps decades, before it was removed or lost, is still visible, if you know what you are looking at. Elias Marsh's children, Thomas and Ruth, never spoke publicly about their father's logbook. Whether they knew about the October 1884 entry is unknown. Thomas Marsh died in 1923. Ruth Marsh Bellamy died in 1931. Neither of them, in any document that has surfaced, ever mentioned the Mercy Jane. But Thomas Marsh, in a letter written to a friend in Baltimore in 1902, 1 year after his father's death, mentioned something that researchers only connected to this story decades later. He wrote, "My father kept something on the shelf in his room until the end, a piece of wood, gray, old, the kind of gray that wood turns after a very long time in the water. I asked him once where it came from. He said it was a reminder. I asked him what it reminded him of. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, that things that are gone are not always as gone as we believe. I did not understand what he meant then. I am not certain I understand it now. But he held that piece of wood the way some men hold photographs, as if it was a face. That is the legacy Elias Marsh left, not a ghost story, not a mystery he solved or explained. A piece of wood the color of deep water, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who kept the light burning and wrote down what he saw, even when what he saw could not be. The lighthouse still stands. The logbooks are in archives, most of them. The coast is still what it has always been, dark, cold, and full of things that went down and did not come back. Or almost did not come back, almost. Right now, somewhere on the Atlantic coast, on a night with northeast winds and building swells and a sky the color of old iron, the light that used to shine from Marsh's station is dark. Has been dark for decades. But fishermen who work that stretch of water, the ones who have worked it long enough to know its rhythms and its moods, will tell you, if you ask them the right way, on the right kind of night, that there is sometimes a sound you can hear out there when the weather builds, a bell, 3 rings. Clear and close, coming from a direction that the buoy charts do not account for. They do not make a big thing of it. They are practical people, fishermen. They have a living to make and a sea to navigate, and they do not have time for stories. But they hear it. And when they hear it, the older ones among them do what Elias Marsh did on that October night in 1884. They look out toward the darkness, toward the place where the sound is coming from, and they wait, and whatever they see or do not see, they keep to themselves, the way men of the sea have always kept the things that come to them out of the dark. This is what you just heard on the Fear Sermon. A lighthouse keeper, 40 years after a ship went down, wrote its name in his logbook. The government restricted that logbook. The timber he found on the rocks disappeared. The bell still rings sometimes out past the reef in the dark. And a man who never lied in 22 years of federal service wrote down what he saw and could not explain it. Before you go, we need to do 2 things together. First, if this story shook you the way it should have, share this video right now, put it on your social media. Send it to someone you know who stays up too late reading about things like this. Every share tells YouTube this story deserves to be seen, and it keeps the Fear Sermon alive so we can keep bringing you the true stories that the textbooks left out. Second, leave a comment right now. Tell us what state you are watching from, and tell us what you think happened that night. Not what is possible, what you think happened. We read every single comment on this channel, and the best ones become part of our next discussion. But here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to answer it in the comments right now, because this is the one that keeps me awake. When Elias Marsh walked down to that cove in the rain and stood at the water's edge and spoke to the man at the rail of the Mercy Jane, do you believe that what he saw was something that came back? Or do you believe that what he saw was something that never truly left?